Chapter 8, Mishnah 7. The Mishnah teaches how someone can give his property to his children as a gift, but still keep for himself the right to use the property and take its produce as long as he is alive. Someone who wishes to write a document giving his property to his children, but wishes to be able to use the property and keep its produce as long as he is alive, must write in the gift document that he is giving them the property from today and after my death. This language means that the actual property itself becomes the property of the children immediately, but the father keeps the right to use it and keeps its produce until he dies. But if he does not include the words "from today," the gift does not take effect, because the document then states that he is giving them the property after his death, and at that time the property is no longer his. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yossi says he does not need to include the words "from today" in the document, even if he simply writes that the gift is to take place after my death. That gift still works as he wishes, because the fact that the document is dated with today's date shows that he meant for the gift to begin, with respect to the property itself, from today. The Gemara discusses the laws that apply to property that is given as a gift in this way. If someone writes a document giving the body of his property to his son, but keeps the use and produce of the property for himself during his lifetime, in the way described above, the father cannot then sell the property itself to someone else, because the property itself has already been given to the son, and thus the son owns the property, not the father. But the son also cannot sell the property in a complete manner while the father lives, because the property is still in the domain of the father to some extent, due to the fact that the father has the right to use the property and take its produce as long as he lives. Therefore, if the father sold the property, it is sold only until he dies. That is, the buyer has the right to use the property and take its produce as long as the father lives. But once the father dies, the property and the produce both belong to the son. And if the son sold the property while his father was still alive, the buyer has nothing from the property until the father dies, because the rights to use the property and keep its produce until that time belong to the father, and the son cannot sell those rights. Once the father dies, however, the property and its produce go to the buyer. The Mishnah now teaches additional laws that apply when a father gives property to one of his sons, but keeps the rights to its produce during his lifetime. The father may detach produce from the property and feed it to whomever he wishes as long as he lives, because the produce belongs to him. And as for any detached produce that he left in the property at the time of his death, it belongs to all of his heirs equally, not only to the son to whom he gave the field. Since the produce was detached from the ground during the father's lifetime, it is his property, not the son's. And when he dies, the heirs share it equally. Produce that was still attached to the ground when the father died, however, would belong to the son who owns the body of the property alone, not the other heirs. The Mishnah now begins a new discussion about a person who died and did not leave any instructions regarding how his property was to be distributed. The Mishnah teaches whether the children may use money from the estate for various expenses before the estate is divided among the children. If the father died and left both older sons and younger sons, the older sons are not clothed at the expense of the younger sons. That is, the older sons may not take money from the undivided estate for their clothing, since this will not be fair to the younger sons, who require much less money to provide for their clothing. And similarly, the younger sons are not given food from the undivided estate at the expense of the older sons, since younger sons require more expensive food, and this would not be fair to the older sons. Rather, they divide the estate equally, and then each one takes his food and clothing allowance from his own share. The Mishnah deals with the question of whether wedding expenses are paid for from the undivided estate. If the older sons married after the father died and they paid for the wedding expenses from the undivided estate, then the younger sons are also entitled to marry and have their expenses paid for from the undivided estate. Therefore, an amount of money equal to that spent by the older sons is set aside for the younger sons' wedding expenses, and then the remainder is divided equally. But if the older sons had married while the father was still alive, and the father paid the wedding expenses at that time, and now, after the father's death, the younger sons say, "We wish to marry using funds from the estate in the manner that you married with our father's funds," we do not listen to them. Rather, whatever the father gave the older sons for their weddings while he was alive, he gave. But the younger sons do not receive any money for wedding expenses from the undivided estate, and they must pay for the weddings from their share of the inheritance.